Hello everybody, on this video lecture we're going to cover the anatomical features of the urinary system and go away. And here's a diagram from your textbook which is showing you the gross anatomy of the urinary system. Most of our urinary system anatomy we're going to be focused in on microscopic structures within the kidneys where urine formation takes place. But here's your gross anatomy. Here are your left and your right kidneys. And the kidneys, of course, are responsible for filtering blood and producing the urine. And that urine then travels through the left ureter or the right ureter down here to the bladder. The bladder is the storage compartment for the urine, and then the urine is going to pass out of the bladder and into the urethra, which is going to be the tube that's going to carry or convey the urine to the outside of the body. I'm actually going to switch over to visible body so we can take a look in 3D at these structures. This first view I'm bringing up is showing most of the contents of the abdominopelvic cavity, because I want to rotate this around and just give you a refresher or a reminder about the locations of the kidney. So there's the right kidney that I'm highlighting. The kidneys in this particular view in visible body have actually been cut in half. But there's the right one, and there's the left one over here. And do multiple select there, and we'll select the left one over there as well. So what I want you to notice, I'm just doing this to remind you that the kidneys are actually in a posterior position compared to other major organs of the abdominopelvic cavity. And they're actually located behind the parietal peritoneum. They are retroperitoneal. All right, and so now let's take a different look at the components of the urinary system. And this is a female view. Kind of zoom out here. We're going to take a look at the female and the male. Okay, and here's the right kidney, there's the left one over there. Of course, you can see they're pretty high up. A lot of times people think their kidneys are lower, but they're actually pretty high up there, and they're behind the stomach and the liver and so forth. And let's deselect those. There's your left ureter, there's the right ureter, and so those, of course, are carrying urine from the kidneys down to the bladder. Now, this is a female view. And so I'm going to deselect those, and I'm going to do some dissection here to get rid of some of these structures so we can see what's going on a little bit better. Okay, so when I strip away the bones there, in the female, here's the bladder, highlighted in blue. And let's highlight the left ureter here, because I want to rotate around to the back and give you a little bit better impression. Let me deselect those for a minute. Let me get rid of these ligaments. There we go. All right, there's the left ureter, and there's the right ureter. And so if we zoom in here, that gives you kind of an impression about where the left and the right ureter connect into the bladder. So they actually connect in on the posterior side of the bladder and also in an inferior position. And we rotate around, and let me deselect those. Going to hide those structures as well. Now this organ that you see right there is the uterus in the female, and then here's the bladder in the female. So the bladder actually extends in an anterior direction compared to the uterus, and it's also inferior to the uterus. And so you can imagine, if you have a developing fetus inside this uterus, why that compresses a female's bladder and causes her to need to empty her bladder more frequently. All right, some other structures on here. Let me hide that membrane. Okay, so here's the bladder, and here's the urethra highlighted in blue. And so right here, this is the female's external genital anatomy here, but that opening right there is the external urethral orifice through which urine flows, and you can see the opening for the urethra is actually like this. It's actually anterior, I'm sorry, more forward on the body. All right, so again, there's the urethra in the female, and notice this ring-shaped muscular structure there. That is the external urethral sphincter. Let me highlight that. That is a muscular sphincter that, of course, can contract and relax, and that's under voluntary control. So when you are ready to release urine, that sphincter relaxes and urine is able to flow to the outside of the body. Now you have another sphincter as well. I'm going to deselect that one. And this is called the internal urethral sphincter, and it's located right here where the bladder and the urethra join together. That one is under involuntary control. So when you need to urinate, this sphincter opens, urine flows and starts pressing up against the external urethral sphincter. Now the other tissues have been stripped off, but this external urethral sphincter is actually located at the bottom of the muscular wall of the pelvic cavity. So when you have the urge to urinate, you're feeling the urine pressing up against that structure there, and that lets you know, hey, I gotta go. And let's switch gender, switch over to the male gender, urinary, and let's take a look at these structures in the male. And of course, most of the other tissues, obviously, other organs and so forth, have been stripped away. But you can see that the arrangement of the kidneys and the ureters is essentially the same in the male. You can see back here, there's the right ureter and there's the left ureter, and those are connecting into the bladder. Now this structure that you see right there that kind of looks like an apple, that's called the prostate gland, and obviously females don't have that. We'll be talking about the prostate gland when we cover the reproductive system here in the second half of Unit 5. But the urethra in a male actually exits the bladder and passes through the prostate gland. That's one of the reasons why men, as they get older, the prostate gland can enlarge, and it presses up against the urethra and also up against the bladder, and it can cause men to feel like they need to go to they need to urinate more frequently, and it also makes it more difficult for the urine stream to flow through the urethra. Let me strip off the bones there, and I'm going to highlight the prostate again. There's some different tissue layers here. So if I strip that away, and don't worry about the other things that you see on there, because we're going to cover those when we get to the reproductive unit. But right there, that's the first part of the urethra in a male, so it's extending out of the bladder through the prostate gland. Now the internal urethral sphincter in a male is going to be at the same location it is in a female. It's going to be where the urethra and the bladder come together. So that's involuntary. When you feel like you need to go urine, that sphincter opens up, travels through here, and then in the male, the external urethral sphincter is located right there. So it's also in the muscular floor of the pelvis, just like it is in a female. But in a male, this is also located at the entrance into the penis, because most of the urethra in a male travels through the inside of the penis. So let's deselect that, and I'm going to have to hide the structures inside the penis so we can see the rest of the urethra. So there it is. That's going to be deep inside the penis, and it's going to lead to right here at the head, or the glands. This is also called the glands of the penis. There's your opening right in there, highlighted in blue. That is your external urethral orifice in the male. Okay, so just wanted to cover some of the differences between the male and the female. The rest of the anatomy for Chapter 25, urinary system, is really going to involve more detailed structures inside the kidneys. All right, so this is actually a diagram from your textbook, which is showing you a real human kidney that has been sliced open so that you can see it in cross-section. And over here is a nice diagram of this cross-section. And so some things, if you're using your anatomy study guide, two major portions of the kidney you need to know: the renal cortex. So we've heard the term cortex before. regarding other anatomical structures. And so those are the parts of an organ, like the adrenal gland, for example, that are near the surface. They're the more superficial sections. So all of these lighter colored areas you see on here represent the cortex of the kidney. Then the renal medulla you can think of as like middle or interior areas. On here where you see these darker colored structures that kind of look like shells on the diagrams, those areas all comprise the renal medulla. There's another name for the subunits of the renal medulla that you guys should know. All right, so each of these, see how it's kind of got a triangular shaped structure to it? Now in reality, those are three-dimensional in shape. And they're shaped more or less like cones, or they kind of look like volcanoes, but they're called renal pyramids. Each of those is a renal pyramid. And they're oriented towards the very center. If you think about it, they're actually cone-shaped. To me, they kind of look like volcanoes when you see them on a 3D model of a kidney in a lab. They're oriented, what we're going to see as you study the physiology part of the unit. These pyramids are full of tubes called collecting ducts through which the urine that has developed in the kidneys flows. And these collecting ducts converge together down here at that point where it kind of looks like a bump or a hill. And that is called a papilla, a renal papilla. And you've heard the term papilla before in anatomy, like the papillary sublayer of the dermis of the skin, where you've got those hills that poke up into the epidermis. You've got a hill-like structure here, and that is called a papilla. And urine basically squirts out from the papillae of these renal pyramids, and it enters into, deep in the center of each kidney, these compartments that you see in there that have kind of a yellowish to a beige color. That's where the urine that has developed in the kidneys collects. And so it leaves the pyramids out of those papillae, and it first enters smaller compartments that I'm kind of coloring in blue here. Each of those is called a minor calyx, and calyces is the plural form of that word. Then let me change pen colors here, and those lead to these larger urine-filled compartments, and I'm kind of coloring in green here, and each of those is a major calyx. Major calyces would be plural. And then finally, in orange here, I'm going to color in, you've got an area in here that's called the renal pelvis. And that is where the urine ends up just before it enters the ureter, right there. And then the ureter is going to take that urine down to the bladder. So the urine that is forming in the kidneys flows out of these renal pyramids. The papillae are the little hill-like structures where the urine squirts out, enters a minor calyx, that leads to a major calyx, and then finally a major calyx is going to lead to the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis is going to take that urine to the ureter. The ureter is going to bring it to the bladder. The bladder is then going to empty the urine into the urethra when urination needs to take place. And you can see over here on the cross-section of a real human kidney, you can see what these structures look like. They do pretty much resemble the diagram, including the color differences that you see there. Something else I need to point out here on this diagram before we move forward. Notice how you got these lighter colored areas that kind of look like columns between the pyramids. Each of those is called a renal column. And that term renal column, they're tissues that are more like the cortex than the renal pyramids or the medulla. So you've got these areas of cortex columns that are located between the renal pyramids. All right, let's move on over here to this next figure. This is showing you some major blood vessels of the kidneys that you should be familiar with. And you don't need to know all of the blood vessels. So your textbook provides more information about blood flow through the kidneys. And, you know, I want you to know some of these, but you don't have to know everything that your textbook is showing you. All right, so as you guys learned back when we did the cardiovascular unit, oxygenated blood enters the kidneys through a renal artery, left or right, depending on which kidney you're taking a look at. The renal arteries branch off of the descending aorta. And you may remember that those renal arteries are pretty big compared to the other arteries that branch off of the descending aorta. And so what that means is a pretty significant proportion of the blood that is passing downward through the descending aorta is going to exit off into either the left or the right renal artery. And indeed, the kidneys do filter the blood very, very frequently. And some of those statistics are covered over on the physiology side for this particular chapter. The renal artery then branches into smaller arteries to distribute this oxygenated blood that's going to be filtered in the kidneys. And eventually those branches lead to what are called interlobar arteries. These are these red ones that extend through the columns. And that's carrying oxygenated blood between the pyramids and out toward the cortex. Because the cortex is going to be the site of urine formation. This is where these structural subunits that are so critical for forming the urine are located. So you have those interlobar arteries, and then those lead to these arteries that arch over the tops of the renal pyramids. Those are called arcuate arteries. I'm actually not going to ask you to identify those on the test. I may ask you to identify the interlobar arteries and veins, but I won't ask you about the arcuate arteries and veins. But I'm just adding those in here since we're talking about the overall blood flow. And then those lead to many, many branches that are called interlobular arteries. So unfortunately, you've got two names that are very similar, interlobar and interlobular. The interlobular ones are much smaller, and your textbook refers to these as the cortical radiate arteries, because they're bringing blood up into the cortex where urine formation is going to take place. And there are many, many, many of them. So they give the appearance of radiating like this through the cortex of the kidneys. Okay, and so this oxygenated blood is coming in. We've got two functions going on here. One is that this blood is going to be filtered by these urine-forming structures in the kidneys that we're going to be taking a look at. And the other purpose is this blood actually has to supply, your kidneys are live, living, functional, metabolically active tissues, so they need nutrients and oxygen gas. They're generating wastes that need to be carted away just like other parts of the body. So this blood, this incoming oxygenated blood, is feeding the kidneys, but it's also traveling to the cortex of the kidney for filtration so that we can remove wastes and make sure our blood plasma stays nice and clean. Each of those arteries I just mentioned also has a corresponding vein, and those are labeled on here as well. So your interlobular arteries bring blood to these urine-forming structures in the cortex. After that blood has been filtered, and also after it becomes deoxygenated, that blood is going to enter interlobular veins. Those connect into these arcuate veins. Those lead to interlobar veins, and eventually those lead back to over here, the renal vein. And then the renal vein connects into, hopefully you remember, the inferior vena cava. And then the inferior vena cava, of course, is going to take that deoxygenated blood back to the right atrium. All right, so those are some of the major blood vessels that that provide the blood supply to the kidneys. And now let's take a look at these urine-forming subunits that we have in the kidneys. So this is a diagram from your textbook, which is showing one of these. And how does this blood get filtered? So the urine-forming subunits or structures in the kidneys are called nephrons. And they're very convoluted, complex little structures. They're composed of tubules. And tubules is a term for a microscopic tube, a very thin, small tubing. And that these tubules are filled with filtrate. And filtrate is really another term for the developing urine. Its composition is in the process of being finalized here within the kidneys. And that's why they're colored with this kind of yellowish brown color on the diagram. Where you see those in these urinary system diagrams, that's letting you know you're looking at structures that are involved in urine formation. So we're going to filter the blood, and how all this happens will be covered over on the physiology side. But if you notice here, so in red, that's one of those arcuate arteries we were just taking a look at that arches over the tops of the pyramids. And those lead to, right in here, that's one of those cortical radiate arteries or interlobular arteries. So that's bringing blood out into the cortex. The cortex is the site where these nephrons are located. And you have tons. These nephrons are microscopic structures, so you have millions and millions of these distributed across the cortices of your two kidneys. Okay. So if you notice on here, let me erase that, there is a red blood vessel that's branching off and leading to this nephron structure, and that is called an afferent arteriole. So it's a very, very, very small artery, and that is leading to this blood filtration apparatus that we're going to be studying. And that leads to, inside this structure you see there, there is a wadded up capillary bed there called the glomerulus. All right, so that is the glomerulus is a capillary bed from which blood plasma and most of the solutes in the blood plasma are filtered out. So this is this process of filtration that we've talked about before that takes place inside the kidneys. The filtered fluid enters this capsule that you see here that's colored in yellow. So on the diagram it's labeled as the glomerular capsule. So that is surrounding the glomerulus, which is a capillary bed that's inside there. So the glomerular capsule is going to capture or contain this filtrate or filtered fluid that has been squeezed out of the blood. Together, the glomerulus inside that structure and the glomerular capsule, which is the outer covering, that's called the renal corpuscle, and another name for that is Bowman's capsule. Bowman was the dude who originally discovered these. And these are all located in the cortex of a kidney. So there will be millions of these structures there. Okay, that corpuscle, the renal corpuscle, those two structures together, your glomerular capsule and the glomerulus on the inside, they're the first part of the nephron. And again, the nephron, this whole thing that you see here, that's a nephron. This is the functional unit of the kidneys where urine formation takes place. Also, I forgot to point out, so you got the glomerulus in here inside the glomerular capsule, and the blood gets filtered in there, and the filtered blood then leads to another blood vessel over here that's called the efferent arteriole. So our blood flow here is blood's coming in through a cortical radiate artery, also known as an interlobular artery, exits off into an afferent arteriole. An afferent arteriole leads to a glomerulus that is contained within a glomerular capsule. That's where filtration takes place. You squeeze out plasma and solutes, and that's going to become your urine ultimately. And the filtered blood then exits the glomerulus and enters an efferent arteriole. So we have kind of this breaks the rules of what we've talked about before, where arterioles lead to capillaries, which lead to venules. This is a special case where you have an afferent arteriole, an incoming arteriole, that leads to a capillary bed, a specialized capillary bed called the glomerulus, and then that actually connects into another arteriole. So our blood is still considered to be oxygenated and nutrient rich at this point. And then that efferent arteriole is going to lead to a capillary bed that we'll see on the next slide, I believe, or maybe the next one after that. Some other parts of the nephron here that you need to be familiar with, and again, the function is going to be discussed more on the physiology side. Okay, so this whole thing is considered to be a nephron, and we said this first structure here is the corpuscle, the renal corpuscle, which consists of the glomerular or Bowman's capsule with the glomerulus on the inside. So inside that capsule you'll have the urine, the earliest filtrate, the immature urine that is developing. And as it passes through the rest of this nephron structure, what's going to happen is adjustments will be made to the composition of that filtrate. So there are good things in that filtrate that the body needs to hang on to, like glucose and amino acids, important nutrients like those. Things like sodium, you've heard before about how sodium needs to be reabsorbed. Water needs to be reabsorbed in the kidneys out of the urine. And so those types of processes are taking place within these nephron structures. And you're going to learn a whole lot more about how that works over on the physiology side. All right, so beyond the glomerular capsule, this section of the nephron is called the proximal convoluted tubule. Convoluted because it looks all wiggly. All right, and then that leads to a structure called the nephron loop. Here in blue, that's your nephron loop, or your loop of Henle. And the other thing I want to point out to you, there is a descending limb over on this side because the filtrate, the developing urine, is flowing down, it's descending, and then it turns around and heads back up this way. And that second arm of the loop is called the ascending limb. So it's named according to how the filtrate or the urine is flowing through that structure. And the last section of the nephron over here, where it gets all wiggly again, that is called the distal convoluted tubule. All right, and then that is leading to this thicker tube that you see over here. That is called a collecting duct. All right, so the movement of the filtrate or the developing urine through a nephron, it starts in the glomerular capsule, then it passes through the proximal convoluted tubule, then the descending limb of the loop of Henle, then the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, then the distal convoluted tubule, and finally it enters a collecting duct. Proximal and distal here are referring to being closer or more distant from the renal corpuscle. Okay, so the proximal convoluted tubule is closer to the renal corpuscle. The distal convoluted tubule is farther away from that. So if you notice here on our collecting duct, there's your collecting duct. Distal convoluted tubules of nephrons connect into those. Hang on, a screen turned dark for a second. And so all these stumps you see on the diagram, those are representing various distal convoluted tubules of many, 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 many other nephrons, and they've been cut off to make the diagram more clear. These collecting ducts, let me back up to a previous slide. These collecting ducts pass through the renal pyramids. So the renal pyramids, the medulla, will be full of those collecting ducts. So the collecting ducts contain the urine that is finishing up its creation, and it's on its way down to these other structures we talked about in the central part of the kidneys, where that urine is going to collect and eventually flow into the ureter. So the collecting ducts have openings in the papillae down in here are the pyramids, and they're going to release the urine that has formed into a minor calyx. That'll lead to a major calyx. That leads to the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis leads to a ureter, just to review what we talked about earlier. All right, so over on the physiology side, we're going to be taking a much closer look at these structures that you see here. But this is a blow-up, as you can see over here on this diagram. We're taking a much closer look at the renal corpuscle. And, all right, so this whole thing that you see right here is a renal corpuscle. The outer structure is Bowman's capsule, or the glomerular capsule. And on the inside in here, all of this, that's the glomerulus. So that's our capillary bed. It's very porous. And blood plasma, the liquid portion of the blood, and most solutes, your smaller solutes, your bigger ones like proteins, generally don't get squeezed out, but most of your other solutes that are smaller, like glucose and amino acids and various electrolytes and so forth, they get squeezed out and enter this space, this capsular space that lies between the capsule itself, the wall of the capsule, and the glomerulus. So that's going to be where your filtrate is located, your earliest form of the urine. Here is a representation of an afferent arteriole that is bringing blood to the glomerulus. In here, the filtered blood leaves through an efferent arteriole. Some other structures on here. Let's see. Over on the physiology side, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't leaving anything out. Right in here, there is a union of a portion of this is what you're seeing right here is a cross section of the ascending limb of the nephron loop, where it's getting ready to become or it's leading to the distal convoluted tubule. So I know on the earlier diagram that we looked at on the previous slide, the distal convoluted tubule was positioned way away from the renal corpuscle, but in reality, that was kind of a 2D look where things had been spread out so you could see them more easily. In reality, the distal convoluted tubule comes back around and is very, very close to the renal corpuscle, like you see here in this diagram. So where your afferent arteriole, the ascending limb of the nephron loop, and your efferent arteriole, where they all come together, you have a structure here that is called the juxtaglomerular apparatus, sometimes abbreviated JGA. And juxta means next to, so this is next to the glomerulus, which is over in here. And so over on the physiology side, we're going to be learning about some cell types that are located within this juxtaglomerular apparatus that regulate how fast the blood is filtered in the kidneys. And also, this structure plays an important role in regulating blood pressure. So if you guys remember, we talked about how the kidneys produce renin, and renin leads to a set of events that help raise your blood pressure. Well, the cells that are involved in the cells that produce or secrete renin are located right in here within this JGA. So we'll be talking about those over on the physiology side. All right, this is another diagram from your textbook, which is showing you two types of nephrons. So not all nephrons are alike. Most nephrons are called cortical nephrons, and here's an example of one. And again, so in yellow there, you're seeing all the tubules of a cortical nephron. So they don't, in reality, they're all wadded up as a 3D structure. They're not all nice and laid out in a pretty way so that you can easily tell where the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule are located. So the reason this is called a cortical neuron, so this is your medulla down in here, and this is your cortex up in here. These are your arcuate arteries and veins that separate those two. So most of your cortical nephron components are located in the cortex of the kidneys. A portion of the loop of Henle, or your nephron loop, does dip down into the medulla. And in purple here, the purple vessels that you see on there, those are called peritubular capillaries. All right, so blood that comes out of it, and take a closer look at these diagrams in your textbook. The filtered blood that leaves the efferent arteriole, so glomerulus to efferent arteriole, that then leads to these peritubular capillaries. This is a capillary bed that wraps around the nephron itself, all those tubules of the nephron. And that's going to be involved in, those capillaries are involved in processes called reabsorption and secretion. And we've heard this term reabsorption before, like reabsorption of sodium out of the urine and back into body fluids. Well, because these peritubular capillaries are so intimately wrapped around these tubules of the nephrons, the tubules of the nephrons contain the developing urine. So if you need to suck some sodium back out of that developing urine and return it to the bloodstream, having those peritubular capillaries there makes that happen very efficiently. Also, the peritubular capillaries are supplying oxygen and nutrients to the tubules themselves, because you do have living cells in there that need food. So they're going to perform that function. All right, then you have another type of nephron, and these are called juxtamedullary nephrons. Juxta, in a sense, means next to, but these nephrons are special ones. So you can see that your proximal and distal convoluted tubules there are down in the lower part of or the deeper part of the cortex, almost in the medulla. And then they have these extremely long nephron loops that dip way down into the medulla. And so because of that, they're called juxtamedullary nephrons. The renal corpuscle here and the proximal and distal convoluted tubules are still in the cortex, but they're almost in the medulla. They're next to the medulla. And when we cover the function of urine formation over on the physiology side, we're going to learn what these juxtamedullary nephrons are used for. They help create conditions that allow concentration of urine when needed. So they're very, very important. Okay, the purple blood vessels that you see wrapped around that long nephron loop of that juxtamedullary nephron, those are called the vasa recta. So they are essentially the peritubular capillaries that hang way down and wrap around the very long nephron loops of a juxtamedullary nephron. Performing the same function, they're there to quickly reabsorb substances back out of the developing urine and return those to the blood when needed. And also they're providing nutrients and oxygen gas and so forth for the living tissues of that nephron loop. So they're They have multiple roles that they're taking on. And then notice here again, here's a collecting duct with lots of distal convoluted tubule stumps cut off. So your collecting ducts receive the filtrate that has been created by these nephrons, and all that drains into collecting duct and moves downward or inward in the kidney through the medulla, through those pyramids, and towards a minor calyx down deep inside the kidneys. So I do want you guys to learn the urine flow. So urine production starts here in one of those renal corpuscles. The first location of the filtrate, the developing urine, is inside within that glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. And then you should be able to trace a drop of urine from that structure through all the parts of the nephron into the collecting duct, through all those compartments deep inside the kidney, and then through the ureter, bladder, and urethra to the outside of the body. That's one of those trace things you guys should be able to put together after studying this unit. Covered most of this already over on visible body, but this is a pretty good diagram from your textbook, which again is reminding you of the differences in the structures of the urethra, especially between a male and a female. And of course, here's the bladder. Oops, hang on. Didn't mean to do that. Behave. Oh, I got how there's. Why is this so big? Hang on. Okay, bladder in a male, bladder in a female. And one thing I want to point out to you here, there is an area in here that's called a trigone structure, which kind of sounds like triangle, and it is referring to a triangular shaped feature, and it's formed by the opening for the right ureter and left ureter, where they connect into the bladder, and then the opening to the urethra down in here. So those openings are all located together in the inferior portion of the bladder, and that's called a trigone structure. If you can draw a triangle between those 3 points. And then in the male, so right in here, that's where your internal urethral sphincter is located. That's involuntary, and when that opens, urine flows through this part of the urethra, which in a male is passing through the inside of the prostate gland. That part of the urethra is also called the prostatic urethra because it's passing through the prostate in a male. And then here's the floor, the muscular floor of the pelvis. And right in there, there's your external urethral sphincter. That's under voluntary control. When a guy is ready to pee, he relaxes that sphincter, and urine then flows through the portion of the urethra that extends through the penis, which is also called the spongy urethra. And we'll learn more about why that is the case when we study the male reproductive anatomy. During the second part of Unit 5, you have spongy tissues that are located within the penis. And then in the female over here, the urethra is way shorter. There's your internal urethral sphincter. Here's your urethra, which is much shorter. The external urethral sphincter is located right in here in the floor of the pelvis. And then you've just got a short stretch from there to the external urethral orifice, the opening to the outside through which the urine is going to flow. All right, and that should be the end, yes it is, of our anatomy overview for the urinary system. So once you've completed this and review the different parts and then go ahead and move on to the physiology, you probably want to make sure you're pretty familiar with these different structural names because that vocabulary is going to be used a lot over on the physiology side. So it'll help you understand the physiology better if you're already familiar with these different anatomical features of the urinary system.